Stop right there, before you type out that apology, before you send that message smoothing things over yet again, before you take responsibility for something that was never yours to carry in the first place. Stop right now and actually think carefully about what you're about to do and why. You did nothing wrong. Say it back to yourself if you need to, out loud even, in an empty room if that's what it takes for it to land. You did nothing wrong. I know how this usually goes because it plays out the same way for so many people. Something happens, tension builds in the room or in the conversation, and somewhere in the aftermath, you're the one left holding the discomfort, scrambling to fix a feeling in the room that you didn't create and don't actually owe anyone a solution to. Maybe you said no to something reasonable, something you had every right to decline. Maybe you had a boundary and someone reacted badly to it, made you feel like the problem for having one. Maybe you simply existed in a way that made someone else uncomfortable, and now the pressure is on you specifically to smooth it over, apologize, make it easier for everyone else but yourself. That pressure is familiar to a lot of people watching this right now, and it's worth naming clearly today, out loud. It's not fair, and you don't have to give in to it anymore. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being the designated peacekeeper in every single situation, the one who apologizes first, regardless of who is actually at fault, just to make the tension in the room go away faster. If that's a pattern you recognize clearly in yourself right now, it's worth asking honestly, without judgment, where it actually came from in the first place. Usually it wasn't built out of genuine wrongdoing on your part, out of a track record of actually causing harm. It was built out of pure repetition, apologizing enough times, in enough situations, over enough years, that it became automatic, a reflex triggered by tension in the air, rather than by any actual fault on your part. Apologizing for something you didn't actually do trains everyone around you to expect it going forward, consistently, as your default response. Every single time you take the blame that isn't yours to take, you're teaching people, without meaning to, that discomfort in the room is automatically your responsibility to fix, regardless of the actual source of that discomfort or who genuinely caused it. That's not a fair lesson to be teaching anyone, and it's definitely not one you're obligated to keep reinforcing just because it's become an ingrained habit at this point, something you do almost without thinking. Let's talk about what actually deserves an apology, because that distinction matters more than most people realize when they're caught in the middle of a tense moment. A real apology belongs to situations where you genuinely caused harm, where your actions, specifically, not your existence, not your boundaries, not your honest opinion stated plainly, actually hurt someone unfairly through something you chose to do or say. That's fundamentally different from someone being upset simply because you didn't do what they wanted you to do, or because you said something true they didn't particularly want to hear in that moment, or because you finally stopped absorbing behavior you used to tolerate silently for years without complaint. Discomfort showing up in someone else isn't automatically evidence of wrongdoing on your part, no matter how strongly it might feel that way when you're standing right in the middle of it. Standing your ground doesn't mean being combative or defensive about everything, snapping back at every single comment, or treating every interaction like an argument waiting to happen, ready to spiral out of control at the slightest provocation. It means holding a simple, steady line internally and externally. I know what actually happened here, and I know I didn't do anything that genuinely requires an apology in this specific situation. You can say that calmly, without raising your voice, without escalating anything, without turning it into a confrontation nobody asked for. You don't need to raise your voice or get emotional to make the point land clearly. Sometimes the most powerful version of standing firm is actually quiet, unwavering, completely without drama attached to it at all, delivered in the same tone you'd use to state any other simple fact. People will test that firmness, especially and predictably, if you've historically been the one who folds first in situations like this. Expect some pushback, some genuine attempts to make you feel guilty anyway, despite everything you've just told yourself. Some reframing of the situation, carefully designed to shift responsibility back onto you, regardless of what actually happened between you. That pushback isn't proof you're wrong about any of this, and it isn't evidence you should reconsider. It's usually proof that your previous pattern of apologizing served someone else's comfort for a long time, quietly and consistently, and now that pattern is finally being disrupted, which naturally creates friction as things adjust to a new normal. There's a real difference between accountability and self-blame, and it's worth understanding that distinction clearly before you decide whether an apology is genuinely warranted in a given moment. Accountability means owning your actual actions honestly and completely when they genuinely caused real harm to someone else. Self-blame means absorbing responsibility for outcomes you didn't control, feelings you didn't cause, or reactions that belong entirely to someone else's internal experience and their own choices about how to respond. Confusing the two, treating them as interchangeable, keeps people apologizing for things that were never theirs to own in the first place, and it can go on for years without anyone stopping to question whether the pattern actually makes sense. You're allowed to disappoint people without that automatically meaning you've wronged them in any real sense. This is worth sitting with directly, honestly, because a lot of unnecessary apologizing comes from conflating disappointment with actual harm, treating the two as though they're always the same thing when they're clearly not. Someone can be genuinely disappointed in a decision you made, deeply so even, and still not be owed an apology for it, no matter how strongly they feel about it in the moment. Their disappointment is a real feeling, and it deserves acknowledgement as exactly that, a real feeling they're having, but it doesn't automatically convert into evidence that you did something wrong just because it exists. Guilt has a specific job to do, and it's worth understanding clearly what that job actually is before letting it steer any decision you make. Guilt exists to alert you when your actual behavior has crossed a line you genuinely believe in, when you've done something that conflicts directly with your own values and your own sense of who you want to be. It's not designed to fire off every single time someone else happens to be unhappy with an outcome, even an outcome you had every legitimate right to choose for yourself. If guilt is showing up here anyway, misfiring in response to someone else's disappointment, rather than to any actual wrongdoing on your part, it's worth questioning that guilt directly, instead of automatically obeying it the way you might have in the past, without thinking twice. Standing your ground gets noticeably harder, specifically with people who are used to you not doing it, who've come to rely on a version of you that folds without much resistance. Family members, longtime friends, people who've known a version of you that apologized reflexively for years, almost automatically, they'll notice the shift immediately, right away, and some of them genuinely won't like it, no matter how reasonably you handle the change. That reaction isn't a verdict on whether you're doing the right thing here, and it isn't proof you should go back to the old pattern to keep things comfortable for them. It's simply what happens whenever someone stops playing a role they've been cast in for a long time, whether or not that role was ever fair to them in the first place, whether or not anyone ever asked if they wanted it. There's a version of maturity that gets mistaken for constant self-sacrifice, constant smoothing over of every tension, constant absorbing of blame, just to keep the peace at any cost, no matter what it does to you internally over time. Real maturity actually looks quite different from that when you examine it closely. It looks like being honest about what actually happened in a given situation, taking full ownership of what's genuinely yours to own, and refusing, clearly and calmly, to take ownership of what isn't yours, even when that refusal feels uncomfortable in the moment. even when it disappoints someone who expected you to fold the way you always used to. That's not selfishness, no matter how it might get framed by someone unhappy with the change. That's clarity, plain and simple, and clarity is worth considerably more than temporary comfort bought at your own expense, over and over, indefinitely. If you've already apologized in situations like this before, more than once probably, out of habit, out of pressure, out of simply wanting things to feel resolved quickly so everyone could move past the discomfort faster, that's worth forgiving yourself for entirely, rather than adding it to the growing pile of things you already feel guilty about carrying. You were doing what felt necessary at the time, with whatever understanding and tools you had available to you then, in that specific moment, under that specific pressure. Today is simply the day you start doing something different going forward, and that shift doesn't require you to punish yourself retroactively for every previous instance where you didn't yet know better or hadn't yet found the words. It's worth thinking through, in advance, exactly what you actually want to say the next time this specific situation comes up, because having language ready ahead of time makes it far easier to hold your ground in the actual moment when emotions are running higher and clear. Calm thinking gets noticeably harder to access. Something simple tends to work best in these moments. I understand you're upset about this, and I'm not going to apologize for something I genuinely don't believe I did wrong. Short, clear, not aggressive in tone, not defensive either, just plainly, calmly honest about where you actually stand. You don't owe anyone an explanation beyond what you're genuinely comfortable giving in that moment either, no matter how insistently they might push for one. Standing your ground doesn't require a full accounting of your reasoning laid out point by point, a defense presented for someone else's approval, or an ongoing debate about whether your boundary was justified enough to count. You're allowed to simply state where you stand once, clearly, and leave it there, without feeling obligated to keep arguing your case indefinitely until the other person finally agrees with you or gives up trying to change your mind. This gets easier with practice, genuinely, even though the first few times will probably feel uncomfortable, maybe even a little frightening if you're truly not used to holding this kind of line in your relationships. That discomfort is completely normal, and it doesn't mean you're doing something wrong or that you've somehow miscalculated the situation. It just means you're doing something unfamiliar to your nervous system and your usual habits, and unfamiliar things almost always feel harder before they eventually start feeling natural, automatic, and far less draining than the alternative ever was. There's also something worth saying about the people who will respect this shift once they actually see it in practice, even if their initial reaction is surprise or a bit of mild resistance at first. Most reasonable people, given a little time and space to adjust, come to genuinely respect someone who holds a clear, calm boundary, far more than someone who folds automatically under the slightest pressure. The relationships that survive this shift intact are usually the ones actually worth keeping around long term. The ones that don't survive it were often relying more heavily on your automatic apologizing than either of you had fully realized or would have admitted out loud before this. It's worth being specific, too, about the difference between an apology and a simple acknowledgement, because people sometimes conflate the two in ways that quietly pressure you into saying more than you actually mean or believe. You can absolutely acknowledge that someone is upset, that a situation was genuinely tense, that things didn't go the way anyone in the room wanted them to, without that acknowledgement sliding into a full apology for something you don't believe you did wrong. Saying "I can see this upset you" is honest and compassionate, a genuine expression of care that doesn't require you to lie about anything. It's not the same thing at all as saying "I'm sorry I did this," and you don't have to let the conversation blur those two very different statements together just because it would be more comfortable or convenient for the other person if you did. There's also a specific trap worth naming directly here, plainly. the demand for an apology as proof of love or loyalty, as though the two are somehow linked. Some people, consciously or not, treat your willingness to apologize as evidence of how much you actually care about them, as though refusing to say sorry automatically means you don't value the relationship enough. That framing puts you in an impossible position, where the only way to prove your genuine care is to falsely claim fault you don't actually believe you have, over and over, indefinitely. Real care doesn't require dishonesty as its proof, and it never has, no matter how convincingly that idea gets presented in the moment. You can care deeply about someone, genuinely and completely, and still refuse to apologize for something you didn't actually do, and those two things can coexist without any real contradiction between them at all. You did nothing wrong. Say it again if you need to, as many times as it takes. Not because saying it out loud makes it magically true on its own, but because it already is true regardless, and repeating it helps it actually sink in past whatever old habit is telling you otherwise right now. There's also something worth saying about the specific moment right after you hold your ground for the first time, the moment where silence follows and nobody quite knows what to say next, where the air in the room feels thick with something unresolved. That silence can feel genuinely unbearable if you're used to filling it with an apology reflexively, out of pure habit built up over years of doing exactly that. Resist the urge to fill it anyway. Let the silence sit there, uncomfortable as it is, without rushing to soften it with words you don't actually mean and won't actually stand behind later. That discomfort passes, every time. It always does, eventually, and it passes considerably faster than the discomfort of years spent apologizing for things that were never yours to carry in the first place. Notice, too, how often the pressure to apologize gets dressed up as being reasonable, mature, or a peacemaker, as though holding a genuine boundary is somehow the immature or difficult choice by comparison, the one that makes you the problem in the story. That framing rarely holds up under any real honest scrutiny once you actually examine it closely. Someone insisting you apologize for something you didn't do isn't asking you to be reasonable at all. They're asking you to accept a version of events that isn't true, simply because it's more comfortable and convenient for them. If you go along with it quietly, the way you might have before. Recognizing that framing clearly for what it actually is makes it considerably easier to decline participating in it going forward, without guilt, without needing to justify the refusal at length. You get to decide, entirely for yourself and on your own terms, what kind of person you actually want to be in these moments, independent of what anyone else expects from you, or has quietly come to rely on over time. Someone who apologizes reflexively just to keep the peace and smooth things over quickly, or someone who tells the truth plainly, even when it creates temporary friction that has to be sat with for a while. Both are genuine choices available to you, and only one of them is truly sustainable over the long run, without slowly, gradually costing you something important about how you see yourself and how much of your own reality you're willing to override just to make someone else briefly more comfortable in the short term.